What we're trying to solve at Swimm is a way to easily download this knowledge, download this information that is in the head of the developers, and create a strong knowledge base around the code that will actually grow as the code is growing, and not something that will be, this kind of like line that is going down every time a developer leaves and some of the knowledge lives with the developer. We want to create something that is growing together with the code.
Welcome to 20-Minute Leaders. Just sit back, relax, and learn from the leaders of today. It's a journey. Each one is different, unique, inspiring. Let's get started. This episode is powered by J Ventures, a community-driven VC fund in Silicon Valley, in partnership with Lomitech, and sponsored by Homeward Ventures, Hippo Insurance, Upwest, Hillel at Stanford, Leap, and Birthright Excel. Hello and welcome to 20-Minute Leaders. Today I am with Oren Toledano, the CEO and co-founder of Swimm, making continuous documentation an integral part of the development lifecycle. An accomplished leader in the high-tech industry, Oren has led numerous international technological training hubs over the past 10 years, including co-founding Israel Tech Challenge in 2012 and serving as the CEO until 2019. Oren has a Bachelor's of Arts in Political Science from the Hebrew University and a Master's in Security Studies from the Tel Aviv University. It's personal career, it's a phenomenal, and amazing different things that you've done, from being a major in the intelligence forces to working in different organizations, being the CEO and co-founder of Israel Tech Challenge, which, as I just explained before we started recording, holds a very dear place in my heart, and I'm very thankful for this program. And just as interesting, if not more, is your most recent adventure, Swimm, with some amazing announcements for an amazing Series A and some great investors on board. Some of them are great friends. And as a developer myself, sort of understanding, where you're coming from and how you're helping, me sort of solve my own issues with how I operate as a developer, and I can then extrapolate to others. And so, a lot of different things to dive into. And Oren, I really want to thank you for coming here. Share with me a little bit about yourself, because you're a founder of various organizations. Are you an engineer, an entrepreneur, founder? Well, how do you think yourself?
So maybe you will notice in the accent, originally I was born in France and grew up there until the age of 17. Moved to Israel, learned Hebrew, studied political science and economics at the Hebrew University of Jerusalem, and had the chance to be selected for Ep820. And that's how my path with technology started. But I served there for 8 years in different positions, as you said, eventually as a major in the part that is more operational and in the intelligence part of the unit. And so that's where I got my knowledge with technology, product, and connecting between the needs or a pain or a need for a solution and the engineering part of that. And I think, as the CEO right now, the ability to balance between the need of a client and the technological specs is something that is important. After this period in the army, I was 3 years in France. I was the head of the Jewish agency for France and Belgium. So like personal thing that I wanted to do. And then I came back, founded, as you said, Israel Tech Challenge, ITC. Was the CEO for 7 years. And that's another layer of understanding technology, understanding the need for human resource. We have been talking a lot these last 2 years in Israel, kind of like discovered the problem of shortage for developers early on and try to solve that through ITC. And also, through my experience at ITC, kind of like got to Swimm, and we'll get there later. But so it's about training, technology, coding, Zionism kind of thing, connection with Israel. So that's my background.
Fantastic. And so there's the element of identifying a gap in the market and a need, both from a human resource perspective, but also from a personality perspective, bridging together Zionism, your own aliyah, your own journey, with the agency, but also on a personal level through, coming to Israel into the army, but then bridging it into engineering and into the actual ecosystem. And do you even know how many engineers you've brought into the ecosystem?
So sometimes
ITC?
I like counting, although it might be a bit problematic. But so there are two numbers that I like to hold for myself. One is hundreds of engineers that I think almost more than 1,000 right now after all these years with ITC. So I think it's kind of a real personal joy.
It's kind of crazy.
Part of this.
It's kind of insane, creating a school that actually created almost, if not more than 1,000 engineers into the ecosystem. This is not trivial. It's not simple.
And as many entrepreneurial journeys, it takes time until you get there, and a lot of effort. And another number that I like is from a period at the Jewish Agency is like 6,000 Jews that came to Israel during this time. So altogether, I think I did my Zionist part for the country, and I'm happy to do like more business right now. But yeah,
I love it.
Those numbers I'm very proud of.
Incredible. So, take me back to the founding of Swimm, because you're touching on, you're in a similar problem space. You're talking about the way that developers are working, more importantly, how they're helping onboard and document for the new hires and their colleagues and for themselves. What is sort of your understanding of the problem space as you're thinking through Swimm?
Yeah, it's actually came from Israel Tech Challenge, because we were training so many people to become developers or to improve themselves in becoming data scientists or cybersecurity researchers. And then we understood that it was a big pain for them to onboard in their new jobs. And we also understood from the companies themselves that it was a big effort, for all what's related with what we call engineer onboarding. And me and my co-founders try to understand where the pain exists exactly. And we met with many companies in Israel and in the US, and we understood that there is the essence of this problem is understanding the code base, right? Understanding the code at the company, and each company has its own stack, its own technologies, its own logic, and there is no dev tool, there is no technology that is built right now to help ramp up engineers. So that's how it started, from the onboarding problem of developers. And then eventually...
But just to clarify, because I think it is an important clarification.
Yeah.
If somebody who's not necessarily an engineer now thinks through this problem, they're thinking, okay, let's equate a repository to a Google Drive folder, and you have a table of contents, and you have a bunch of files, and you just go ahead and print them out and just start reading them, and you'll understand the thesis and the logic. But it's a little different than that, and right. So in what ways?
Yeah, code is very complex. It has been usually when you join a company that is more than 10 developers, already has been written by many developers in different ways, and usually with a kind of like complex logic behind it. And it's not self-explanatory. I mean, some parts of the code are, and if you read code, you can understand parts of it, but you can't understand the complex logic behind it, the different flows and how things were exactly built. And then when you have to contribute code and you have to write a feature or you have to solve a bug, it's kind of complicated. And the way it's done right now is that you ask your fellow developers in the companies, and some of them already left, right? So there is what we call legacy code in many companies. There are areas in the repo, in the code base that nobody really understands and kind of like try to avoid because of the complexity of it.
Yep.
And it results in years of technological debt and a lot of challenges for companies. And we're kind of trying to solve that.
Makes a lot of sense. And so when we go back to this question of complexity, what makes it complex in your mind? Is it simply that coding is complex, that engineering is complex, or is it the habits that we formed that make it complex?
Yeah, it's a good question. I think it's a mix, as many things. It's the fact that code is a complex creation, right? And as it becomes more and more advanced, it becomes more and more complex. So you have microservices and all kind of additional technologies and third-party libraries you're adding. So it becomes this very complex and beautiful creation, but also very difficult to explain, right? And as you said, another part of that is that we didn't have the tools or the good habits to create a knowledge base around the code base itself. So you have all this code that is being written, and you know that the developers are in shortage. So you don't want them to do too much that is not coding. So every time they write a line of code, they can't actually document this code and can't explain it. But you know, the result of that is every time someone needs to understand the code, they actually they need the developers themselves to explain it. But you know, it's kind of like a messy situation at the end of the day where the knowledge is very scattered in different places in the head of the developers, and there is no good way to download all this information that is in the heads of many developers. Some of them, as I said, already left the companies, and to make it something that you can easily understand and you can easily contribute as a result of getting to this information, getting to this knowledge. So what we're trying to solve at Swimm is a way to easily download this knowledge, download this information that is in the head of the developers, and create a strong knowledge base around the code that will actually grow as the code is growing, and not something that will be, you know, this kind of like line that is going down every time a developer leaves and some of the knowledge lives with the developer. We want to create something that is growing together with the code.
So once again, we're tying together the educational piece of it, the best habits piece of it, and then the whole a larger question of behavior of engineers, and how do you actually create a product that's sticky for engineers to write the documentation and to contribute to it.
Sure.
And how do we make it informative and educational for those that are receiving it, right? Sure. And so you're playing with similar sides like you had with ITC, which I find fascinating. You know, the progression of understanding here and how you're implementing it. Tell me a little bit about the product. Well, how does
Sure. So when we started learning about, you know, what is documentation, you know, it's something that developers hate because it's like overhead for them to write documentation. So they have, I think, three main pains that we discovered while doing that. It's hard to write documentation. It's hard to maintain documentation because the code is changing all the time. So as you are writing documentation, it becomes obsolete very quickly. And also, it's very hard to find documentation in time when you need it. As you said, it's a Google Drive, so let's do the right search to find the right docs or whatever. And most people just give up. And the fact that they have all these issues make the essence of writing documentation really not appealing. Because if I know that it's going to be very quickly obsolete and nobody will find it, I don't want to write it, right? It's kind of like I hate it. So what we're trying to rebuild here is this relationship between developers and documentation. So make it easy to write, easy to maintain, and easy to find. And the way to do it is, in our opinion, is to connect it very deeply with the CI/CD, with the workflow of the developers, making it very intuitive for developers to write this documentation. And in some cases, we will help them with automated documentation that we will create based on patterns in the code itself. We will make it easy to maintain. So we will connect the docs that we're creating with Swimm with the code itself, and we will be actively following after the changes in the code. And with our smart algorithm, we'll be able to say, this doc is outdated, we will update it automatically for you, or we will flag it for you and you will update it. And because of this connection with the code itself, while you are in the IDE, in the environment of the developer environment, we will tell you exactly where a doc is relevant, you know, when you're working. So if you're working on this piece of code, we'll tell you here in your IDE, there is a doc that is relevant, and you will be able to read it in your IDE. So we try to avoid context switch, which is a big problem for developers.
So it sounds like you lay the groundwork here to say, you know, we understand fundamentally that we cannot do context switching for engineers. You know, part of it is that, you know, we like things in the shell or in our IDE. We don't want to transition to different applications. You're not going to find engineers on Slack for most of the day because we don't want to do the command tab and go to different applications, which makes sense. Then you're saying we actually can create a layer of technology that will maintain the information of which docs are relevant and up to date, very similar to how, let's say, npm makes sure that if you install a package, maybe it has dependencies that are also not up to date. So we've already seen a model here that works, which makes a lot of sense. But then you said something interesting about the CI/CD process. So I'm curious about how do you get engineers to contribute to this? And you said that was a part of the CI/CD. Is that an enforcement mechanism that
Yes.
before they deploy and before they get their feature out, they have to contribute to the documentation?
So enforcement is a word that we don't really like, but but it's also right. But it's kind of like building a culture of documentation, right? So once you couple the code with the docs, you want to ensure that the work you've done as a developer is not going to go out of sync, right? So if it's part of the build, if it's part of the CI/CD, and you decide as a team to block every time a PR, every time it goes out of sync, so it becomes this habit, right? You're building these habits of making sure the docs are up to date. But in many cases, in more than 90% of the cases, Swimm will update automatically the docs. So we'll make just sure it's another step in the build that the docs stay up to date.
But how do you actually cope with logic changes? I mean, because you have to differentiate between semantic changes, yes, plus one more parameter or one less parameter versus, okay, there's actually a logic change to how company X thinks about entity Y, which actually has a butterfly effect that is pretty massive.
So it's part of our secret sauce, and the patent that Swimm has is by adding snippets of codes in the doc themselves, and by looking at these snippets and the contextual change and the syntax change that happens around these snippets, we're able to decide whether the changes were important or were just changes that happen all the time, like changes of names, changes of lines or whatever, or even additions in the code themselves, but that don't change the real essence of the code. So based on this algorithm that analyzes these changes, we can decide whether to update the doc automatically or tell the developer, you need to take a look at that because it's outdated.
That makes a lot of sense. Swimm is a company now, so you have the product, strategies for getting into the market. How do you, a little bit about go-to-market and
Sure.
and how do you actually get this to scale across every organization potentially?
Sure. So with developers, there is a playbook that you may follow or not, but it has to be a PLG approach. At least it needs to have a part of it that is PLG, product-led growth, meaning that developers want to test the product themselves. They want to make sure they like it. There is what we call developer happiness. So it needs to be, it's really like almost a B2C approach when you need to the approval of the developers. So there is this motion that we called bottom up. And there is another motion that we call top down, and it's more like a B2B sales practice that you need to have with bigger organizations because for the reasons of connecting the docs with the code, we need sometimes some security process and an IT process. And for some companies, the bottom-up approach won't work because they need some approval and some process. So you need to have the two motions going on. So you have like a marketing product approach that works for PLG, and you have like marketing sales approach with a sales team that works top-down and work with usually more senior people in the organizations.
And I can imagine there's a few different KPIs that you can measure all the way from how updated are the documentation versus what percentage of engineers are engaging with the documentation, reading it or writing it. What are the KPIs that you really what is?
Well, listen, when you're a SaaS and PLG, most importantly, you need to like measure all parts of the funnel, right? So like conversion from website to sign up. And then you need to measure adoption. So how do you measure adoption? How fast it is to write a first doc? How fast people invite additional people from the team? How team moves from one team to two teams to three teams? How many docs are being written? How many docs are being written? How are being read? How many docs are being maintained? how many docs goes through the CI process, and so all this we measure, and we see a level of adoption, number of users that are interacting with the platform, et cetera, et cetera. And it's definitely a land and expand motion. So you start usually with one team, and then it grows to another. The fact that you are inside the build, inside the CI/CD, so everybody sees you in GitHub or whatever. So there is this this interesting challenge for a product team, and it's a very, very product-oriented strategy.
No, and I think that something that's really fascinating about this strategy is that given that you succeed here with working with a company and becoming a part of the CI/CD process, the opportunities are pretty limitless for you as a company, because all of a sudden you can find yourself as a Swimm, potentially as a Series C company, transitioning from just helping documentation to actually helping, make sure that the code is actually up to date with all the packages in the outside world and best practices. You have visibility into the best practices of engineers all over the world, and you can actually help companies help engineers become better engineers through better habits, which is a lot of interesting things.
I want to say something that won't sound very humble, but sometimes you need to hear it from outsiders. So we were raising our Series A, and we met with one of the important investors in New York, and then I met them after a while, and they told me, the thing I heard from your presentation about Swimm is that actually you're building a better and smarter Atlassian. And, we didn't think about that. Atlassian is, one of the biggest dev tool companies dealing with, also documentation, but also task management and also Git hostings, etc. So kind of like when you own this knowledge on the code itself, and you're able to understand who does what and how it's done, and, what are the best practices, from this essence of the code, you can go, in many, many different directions, and I think it's really it's really something that we're looking forward to.
Yeah, and Oren, really, congratulations on the amazing accomplishments all around. The thread here, to me, it seems pretty clear. How you're taking the learnings and experiences from each experience and translating it and advancing it to the next one. And obviously, Swimm, right place, right time, incredible problem, both from the HR perspective, but also from the perspective of automations. And how do you take the current HR that you have and you make it scalable and you make it as efficient as possible? And so I really love what you're doing, and it's fascinating to hear a little bit through your thought process. And obviously we can go on for hours, but we have 20 minutes in the show.
It's true.
And so I really thank you, and
thank you,
best of luck with Swimm.
Thank you,
Stay safe and stay healthy. Thank you.
Thank you. Have a good day.
Thank you.